each night, it's locked away deep beneath the earth. Special humidity and temperature controls shield it from the ravages of time. And each morning, it rises like the sun, a national treasure on display for the world to see.
Maybe you're thinking we're talking about a new kind of weapon, or a diamond worth millions. Nope, it's something much more valuable than that. It's the Declaration of Independence. Written more than 200 years ago, this piece of paper is the very essence of American government.
Give me liberty, or give me death.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Ask not what your country can do for you.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America.
Pretty cool, huh? Along with the United States Constitution, the Declaration of Independence gets its own little vault and security that even a president would envy.
The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights are now assembled in one place for display and safekeeping. Here, so far as is humanly possible, they will be protected from disaster and from the ravages of time.
So what makes it so special?
The Declaration of Independence was a really shocking thing in the world at that time.
Because it grants liberty to us as Americans, and it originated from us breaking off from Britain.
It basically gave people fundamental rights over their leaders.
It's liberty and freedom. That's why it's important.
It's the document that made us. It's our declaring independence and saying that we are going to be a nation, that we are a we. That's a huge moment. And so all by itself, for that reason, the Declaration is very symbolic.
At the most basic level, the Declaration of Independence is an announcement. Back in 1776, it proclaimed that American colonies would no longer tolerate British rule. From that moment forward, the colonies would be free and independent states.
Like a cannon blast, that little bit of parchment knocked the world upside down. But what was the big deal? I mean, was it really so terrible to be part of the British Empire? After all, in the 18th century, Great Britain was one of the mightiest countries on earth, and many of the people living in America had come from England. Why would they want to declare independence from their old friends and relations?
For a very long time, they didn't, because for more than a century, they had the best of both worlds, an alliance with an international powerhouse and virtual self-rule. Between 1607 and 1732, the 13 colonies were established with charters. A charter is a form of written permission granted by the rulers of England. Far from the mother country, each colony set up its own government to make and enforce laws. The colonists gave their approval to those laws by voting for the people who represented them in the colonial legislatures.
That's called consent of the governed.
So even though their colonial charters agreed to abide by the king's rules as well, distance and custom made the king a ruler in name only. But in 1760, a new king ascended to the throne with a different vision of his relationship to the colonies.
His name was George III, and don't be fooled by all that white hair. It's powdered to make him look older and wiser. This guy was just 22 when he inherited a vast empire and a ton of debt.
Great Britain's treasury had been drained by the French and Indian War. A lengthy conflict waged on American soil, it ultimately decided which European power would control the New World, the French or the British. Thousands of British troops sailed across the Atlantic to fight alongside the Americans. By the end of 1763, they had crushed the French, clearing the western wilderness for English settlement.
Oh, good show! King George, you've just won a war. But you've run out of money. What are you going to do? Have a bake sale? If George had thought of that, maybe we'd be singing God Save the Queen right now. But no. George III decided that the colony should foot the bill. After all, they had benefited the most from the British victory.
King George directed Parliament, the British legislature, to make the Americans pay up with a series of taxes. But this seemed unfair to the colonists.
In their own legislatures, they got to elect the lawmakers who levied taxes. They kept those lawmakers accountable. Nobody had been chosen to speak on their behalf in Parliament.
This practice became known as taxation without representation. The Americans figured since they weren't represented, they hadn't agreed to these new taxes, and so they refused to pay them.
The tax that really sent the colonists over the edge was part of the Stamp Act, which was levied in 1765.
All legal documents, as well as printed materials like newspapers and pamphlets, had to carry a special stamp.
It may not sound like much, but the Stamp Act really ticked off the colonists.
Towards evening, some boys began to light a bonfire before the townhouse, which is the usual signal for a mob. Before it was quite dark, a great company of people gathered together, crying "Liberty and Property," which is the usual notice of their intention to plunder and pull down a house.
Anti-tax fever swept the colonies. Many Americans simply refused to comply with the law. And people who had once been loyal to Britain began to lean toward the idea of American independence. A fifth-generation Massachusetts farmer and one of America's most learned patriots, John Adams, was outraged by Britain's attempts to control the colonies.
We must have a representation in our supreme legislatures here. This was the consequence that was drawn by kings, ministers, our ancestors, and the whole nation more than a century ago when the colonies were first settled. And it must be the general sense again soon, or Great Britain will lose her colonies.
In pamphlets and newspaper columns, Adams exhorted his fellow countrymen to break their ties with Britain.
Throughout the early years of our nation, John Adams' influence was so great that Thomas Jefferson called him the Colossus of Independence.
Over the course of his long political career, he served as a delegate to the First and Second Continental Congress, as an ambassador to King George III's court, as the first vice president under Washington, and as the nation's second president.
That's the kind of resume that could only belong to an American original. Under pressure from colonists like John Adams, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but then it turned around and squeezed the Americans with even more taxes. They were levied on everything from glass to sugar to tea. In 1773, that last tax led to a certain costume ball known as the Boston Tea Party. Kind of makes you wonder what exactly King George was thinking. I mean, what part of no taxation without representation did he not understand?
When the colonists protested and didn't seem to want to pay, the British thought that was outrageous. They're colonies, and they're our colonies, and they should be paying us. So the British were outraged, and they became firmer and tried to rein in the colonies, and so you ended up with a very bad sort of an escalating situation that ultimately would end up in a revolution.
Fed up with royal inflexibility, representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies came together in 1774 to form the First Continental Congress. Though many delegates still hoped to maintain their ties to Britain, the Congress resolved that the colonies should prepare to defend themselves. April 19, 1775, Massachusetts colony. British troops zero in on a store of rebel gunpowder. Alerted to the advancing redcoats by patriots like Paul Revere, much of the gunpowder is saved, but men on both sides are killed in the towns of Lexington and Concord. It's the shot heard round the world, and the spark that sets off the American Revolution.
Now, believe it or not, even after all of that, many people were still afraid to cut ties with England.
Americans were afraid to cut ties with England really for two big reasons. Number one, they had always been English subjects. England was the mother country. They loved their mother country. But number two, they'd be cutting themselves off from the most powerful nation on the face of the earth, and they would be little tiny pipsqueaks waiting to be swallowed up by some other country.
When the Second Continental Congress met the month after the battles of Lexington and Concord, the representatives talked about organizing an army. They appointed George Washington to be the army's commander. They even discussed approaching France for aid. But they still weren't ready to declare independence.
The push to finally do so came from an unexpected source. Thomas Paine was an Englishman who had only immigrated to the colonies in 1774. Just 2 years later, he published a pamphlet clearly explaining why an island could not rule a continent and why the colonists should embrace democracy and reject monarchy.
One of the strongest natural proofs of the folly of hereditary right in kings is that nature disapproves it. Otherwise, she would not so frequently turn it into ridicule by giving mankind an ass for a lion.
Thomas Paine was saying that just because you were born to be a king doesn't mean you are qualified for the job. I love a guy who can turn a phrase, and so, apparently, did everybody in the 18th century. Thomas Paine's Common Sense was a runaway bestseller.
It sold 500,000 copies at a time when the entire population of the United States was only a few million. Nearly every literate American must have bought Common Sense. By June 1776, the tide of public opinion had turned. At last, the Second Continental Congress was close to making a momentous decision.
It appearing in the course of these debates that the colonies of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, and South Carolina were not yet matured for falling from the parent stem, but that they were fast advancing to that state, it was thought most prudent to wait a while for them and to postpone the final decision to July 1st.
In other words, to give those waffling delegates more time, Congress took a little break. But over the next couple weeks, a few members would be working very hard.
That this might occasion as little delay as possible, a committee was appointed to prepare a Declaration of Independence.
Thomas Jefferson is the best-known member of that committee, but in fact, 4 other men also served on it.
You had John Adams, who was this big force for independence. You had Benjamin Franklin, who was a wonderful mediator who could smooth things over. And then to balance them out, you had a person like Robert Livingston, who was from the very powerful Livingston family in New York. And then you had the practical, down-to-earth Roger Sherman to sort of balance out maybe some of the lofty thinking of some of the other people in that committee. So it was a very nicely balanced committee.
Because Jefferson was the best writer in the group, the task of articulating the ideas behind the Declaration fell to him. Born to wealth and power, Virginian Thomas Jefferson was an intellectual, an architect, and a naturalist. But most of all, he was a visionary. For him, revolution and democracy weren't just good ideas, they were America's destiny.
How smart was Jefferson? President John F. Kennedy put it pretty well. In 1962, he was giving a dinner at the White House for Nobel Prize winners. A pretty bright bunch of folks by anybody's standards. It prompted the president to say, "I think this is the most extraordinary collection of talent, of human knowledge that has ever been gathered together at the White House," with the possible exception of when Thomas Jefferson dined alone.
Jefferson served as the governor of Virginia, the Secretary of State under George Washington, the Vice President under John Adams, and as the nation's 3rd president. But he didn't care if he was remembered for any of those things. Far more important to him was his role as the primary author of the Declaration of Independence.
Thomas Jefferson, an American original. So what does the Declaration of Independence say, anyway?
I already know the beginning. That's we the people.
All men are created equal, women and children, of course.
Abraham Lincoln wrote it. Is that right?
Maybe we ought to take another look at that document.
When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation.
Like a good term paper, the Declaration starts out with an introduction. That bit about dissolving the political bands is Jefferson's way of saying, "We want out." And the next bit about the laws of nature sets up the colony's justification for doing so.
Natural law was one of the cornerstones of the European Enlightenment, a 17th and 18th century movement that advocated using reason to improve society. Its philosophers, particularly John Locke, had a major influence on Jefferson and the other American revolutionaries. Locke wrote that the natural law was higher than any human law and that it granted certain rights to every individual.
According to Locke, those natural rights were life, liberty, and property. But in the Declaration, Jefferson put an American spin on that trio.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Well, maybe it was self-evident to Jefferson and his friends, but I'm betting King George didn't think it was so very obvious that all people are created equal. After all, as king, he believed that he had the right to rule over others, which means that others were somehow inferior to him. And how about those unalienable rights? Unalienable is another word for inseparable. So these particular rights can't be separated from any human being. No one can give them to or take them away from anybody else. And did you notice that even though life and liberty are givens, that the Declaration doesn't guarantee happiness? It just says we have the right to pursue it. Okay, how would you pursue happiness?
My pursuit of happiness is actually my religious freedom.
I work hard, but each day I take time to maybe just go for a run or read a book or something that I enjoy to relax.
Eating ice cream, I like ice cream. Go-karting or something.
Have fun with my friends, play games and stuff like that.
I'm a college student. I make a career out of pursuing happiness.
That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed.
In other words, not only are natural rights higher than any man-made law, but the whole point of government is to secure or protect those unalienable rights.
While he's at it, Jefferson takes another jab at the monarchy. The bit about consent of the governed means that the people own their government, that power flows from the bottom up, not from the top down.
All in favor say aye. Aye.
And then he delivers the knockdown punch.
That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government.
That's the big one, guys. When the government doesn't listen to the people it's supposed to be serving, when it tramples all over their unalienable rights, the Declaration says the people have the right to overthrow that government and set up a new one.
Most of the rest of the Declaration is a long list of grievances about the king's conduct.
Some of them are pretty juicy, like the one that talks about the king paying soldiers to terrorize the colonies.
He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny.
And some of the passages were too hot to handle, like the one that called slavery evil and claimed that the king had forced the institution on the colonies.
Many delegates from southern colonies believed slavery was necessary for their economic survival. They weren't about to concede that it was an evil practice. When Congress reconvened on July 1st, 1776, the representatives made alterations to Jefferson's original draft, removing the clause about slavery altogether.
How could they say that all men are created equal and still allow slavery?
They feared the issue of slavery would rip apart their unity just when they needed it most. For the sake of the revolution, they postponed taking action. It was a compromise that would haunt the fledgling nation for generations to come. Still, even that difficult decision could not dim the excitement late on the afternoon of the 4th of July. The great moment had finally arrived.
When the Declaration was unveiled and was actually read to the American people for the first time, there was an enormous celebration. There were parades, the militia marched, they had big bonfires, the church bells were ringing supposedly all day and all night in celebration of this great moment in which America really declared itself a nation.
Though copies of the Declaration were printed and rushed throughout the colonies immediately, many members of Congress didn't sign the original till nearly a month later. Some never did.
Adding your John Hancock to the Declaration was a revolutionary act that required solidarity. In fact, Hancock even warned the delegates against pulling in different directions. He told them, "We must all hang together."
To which the legendary wit Ben Franklin is said to have replied, "We must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly, we will all hang separately."
See, those guys couldn't see what the outcome of their declaration would be. For all they knew, they'd soon be overrun by the most powerful military force on Earth. But they did it anyway. They put down all of mankind's greatest hopes and dreams about what government should be, that it should protect life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that its power should come from the people, and if it doesn't, the people should get rid of it. Then they signed it and proclaimed it to the world.
Just as Thomas Jefferson expected, the idea that government should be accountable to its people has inspired citizens in Europe and Latin America, Africa and Asia to cast off inhumane, undemocratic governments. And here in America, those principles have become the bedrock of our American beliefs. In many ways, writing and passing the Declaration itself was the greatest revolution of all, as John Adams pointed out.
The revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people. This radical change in the principles, opinions, sentiments, and affections of the people was the real American Revolution.
The spirit of those revolutionaries lives on in a cherished piece of paper more than 200 years old. In a poetic footnote, John Adams and his old compatriot Thomas Jefferson both died on July 4th, 1826. It was the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence.